Through immense periods of time, the intellect produced nothing but errors. Some of them turned out to be useful and species preserving. Those who hit upon or inherited them fought their fight for themselves and their progeny with greater luck. Such erroneous articles of faith, which were passed on by inheritance further and finally almost became part of the basic endowment of the species, are, for example, that there are enduring things, that there are identical things, that there are things, kinds of material, bodies, that a thing is what it appears to be, that our will is free, that what is good for me is also good in and for itself. Only very late did the deniers and doubters of such propositions emerge. Only very late did truth emerge as the weakest form of knowledge. Thus, the strength of knowledge lies not in its degree of truth, but in its age, its embeddedness, its character as a condition of life. This passage from the Gay Science, Aphorism 110, provides a useful synopsis for today's video and section. In Aphorisms 12 through 16, Nietzsche performs a physiological historical account of these inherited errors. He shows that our highest and most sacred metaphysical truths are not divine revelations, but mere physiological misfires from earlier ages, born from exhaustion and the necessity of survival. What we understand as reason is a recent development from these errors themselves. Aphorism 12, Dream and Culture reads, quote, "The function of the brain that sleep encroaches upon most is the memory. Not that it ceases altogether, but it is reduced to a kind of imperfection, such as in the primeval ages of mankind may have been normal by day and in waking. Confused and capricious as it is, it continually confuses one thing with another on the basis of the most fleeting similarities. But it was with the same confusion and capriciousness that the peoples composed their mythologies, and even today, travelers observe how much the savage is inclined to forgetfulness, how his mind begins to reel and stumble after a brief exertion of the memory, and he utters lies and nonsense out of mere enervation. But in dreams, we all resemble this savage. Failure to recognize correctly and erroneously supposing one thing to be the same as another is the ground of the false conclusions of which we are guilty in dreams, so that, when we clearly recall a dream, we are appalled to discover so much folly in ourselves." End quote. Here Nietzsche maps out an anthropological explanation for why dreams had a profound effect on primitive humans. He points to memory as one of the notable factors that plays a role in past cultures and people's experiences, building on 19th century views on savages, for example. In a state of sleep, our memory is reduced to a condition of imperfection, which he argues may have been typical of sleeping and waking states in primeval people. Nietzsche points out that this confused state in which memory does not work permits the mind to confuse one thing with another because there are simply similarities, no matter how fleeting. In the end, he is pointing out that the state that was normal for past people in waking and sleeping is also normal for us in dreams. He goes on, quote, "The perfect clarity of all the images we see in dreams, which is the precondition of our unquestioning belief in their reality, again reminds us of conditions pertaining to earlier mankind, in whom hallucination was extraordinarily common and sometimes seized hold on whole communities, whole peoples at the same time. Thus, in sleep and dreams, we repeat once again the curriculum of earlier mankind." End quote. Nietzsche argues here that these dreams were once a precondition of the confused beliefs we would have with different things, extending this to whole communities who would possibly all have a similar hallucination. Doing so acts, again, as a psychological and scientific dissection of what we used to hold to be divine revelations. He is indirectly referencing past happenings, such as the dancing plague of 1518 and other Middle Age religious hysteria. By being able to provide an historical and physiological explanation for these occurrences, he bypasses the standard accounts, the metaphysical accounts. He is mapping out the human, all too human. Because the primitive mind sees these dreams in clarity, it does not pose any reason for them to distinguish the dream from reality. Perhaps dreams of dead relatives and community members are taken as proof of the afterlife or other worlds. Dreams of crashing lightning sounding like voices are taken for the proof of a god in the clouds, etc. Nietzsche sees these neurological events that happen throughout our history, which are normally seen as divine revelation, and point out that there are physiological explanations for this behavior. He argues that we inherently equate clarity of perception with objective reality. But, as we saw, Nietzsche thinks this aspect of our biology is still inherent within us. So though we may look to these lesser cultures and past people, and see people who believe in dreams and are susceptible to fantasy and unreason, it is still something which affects us directly. We can extrapolate this to the modern day. Though the context is different, this biological factor can still delude us. Think about how far AI is developing and its capacity for mimicking real events, creating deepfakes that are steadily becoming difficult to discern. The ability of mass media to hold sway over large segments of the population through common causes, which are often designed to cause hysteria and delusion, to cause divide, and so forth. This biological mechanism still plays a great role within us to this day. I think here Nietzsche could have also explored the effects of our daily experiences in the real world. Though dreams have this neurotic kind of effect on us, it seems that the way we experience reality in our waking states also has that same effect, both in earlier times and in the present. One thing is our incessant anthropomorphizing of all things around us. Because we lack the capacity to understand the world around us through rigorous and detached means, we mirrored our limited and personal understanding of the world onto everything around us. We see animals exhibit similar emotions and traits, thus we assume them to have similar, if not the same, abilities as us. Aphorism 13, Logic of the Dream reads, quote, "In sleep, our nervous system is continually agitated by a multiplicity of inner events. Almost all our organs are active. Our blood circulates vigorously. The position of the sleeper presses on individual limbs. His bed covers influence his sensibilities in various ways. His stomach digests and its motions disturb other organs. His intestines are active. The position of his head involves unusual muscular contortions. His feet, unshod and not pressing against the floor, produce an unfamiliar feeling, as does the difference in the way his whole body is clad. All this, through its unusualness and to a differing degree each day, excites the entire system up to the functioning of the brain. And so there are 100 occasions for the mind to be involved in puzzlement, and to look for grounds for this excitation. The dream is the seeking and positing of the causes of this excitement of the sensibilities, that is to say, the supposed causes. If, for example, you tie 2 straps about your feet, you may well dream that your feet are coiled round by snakes. This is first a hypothesis, then a belief, with an accompanying pictorial representation and the supposition, these snakes must be the cause of those sensations that I, the sleeper, feel. Thus the sleeper's mind judges, End quote. Nietzsche begins this aphorism with a continued clinical, psychological, and physiological approach to the explanation of what happens during a dream. This was long before psychoanalysis became popularized by Freud and his idea that dreams acted as a repository for repressed psychological desires. But there's a specific aspect which Nietzsche is interested in pointing out during this exposition, that dreams are primarily somatic, meaning they pertain mainly to the body, particularly bodily movements and functions. He argues that dreams are essentially the brain's way of figuring out what these sporadic and unusual movements of the body are, thus resulting in strange, fantastical experiences within those dreams. Straps around your feet in reality are represented as snakes in your dream, for example. The reason this occurs is because the brain is cut off from the external world and is also functioning at a lower rate, resulting in a state of puzzlement. But internal sensations and outside influence become hyperfixated. In our waking state, we are used to constantly seeking out causes for effects, so the dream state is no different. It just operates in a more confused state. Nietzsche is indirectly calling out, once again, centuries of metaphysical and religious thought. Dreams have been considered messages from the divine throughout history, but here, Nietzsche reduces them to the workings of the body, gastrointestinal distress, poor blood circulation, and muscle contortions. What is being exposed here is not the depth and divinity of dreams, rather the mind's desperate pattern-seeking behavior that would rather invent a fictitious environment than accept unexplained sensory impressions. Nietzsche goes on, quote, "The immediate past he has thus inferred becomes through his aroused imagination the present to him. Everyone knows from experience how quickly a dreamer entwines with his dream a sound that strongly impinges upon him from without. The ringing of bells, or the firing of cannon, for example. That is to say, he accounts for the sound in terms of the dream, so that he believes he experiences the cause of the sound first, then the sound itself. But how does it come about that the dreamer's mind always blunders like this, when the same mind is accustomed to be so sober, cautious, and so skeptical with regard to hypotheses while it is awake, so that the first plausible hypothesis for explaining a sensation that occurs to him is at once accepted as the truth? For in dreams, we believe in the dream as though it were reality. That is to say, we regard our hypothesis as completely proved. In my opinion, the conclusions man still draws in dreams to the present day, for many millennia mankind also drew when awake. The first causa that entered the mind as an explanation of anything that required explaining satisfied it and was accounted truth. According to travelers' tales, savages still do this today. In the dream, this piece of primeval humanity continues to exercise itself, for it is the basis upon which higher rationality evolved and continues to evolve in every human being. The dream takes us back again to remote stages of human culture and provides us with a means of understanding them better. We now find dream thinking so easy because it is in precisely this imaginative and agreeable form of explanation, by means of the first plausible idea that strikes us, that we have been so well drilled over such enormous periods of human evolution. To this extent, the dream is a relaxation for the brain, which has had enough of the strenuous demands in the way of thinking, such as are imposed by our higher culture during the day." End quote. Here, Nietzsche shifts from a physiological explanation to an epistemological explanation for what is occurring during a dream. He begins by pointing out the illusion of time and place that one builds around sensory impressions. If you hear bells or a cannon shot during your sleep, your brain will create a scenario which leads up to those sounds being made or produced, providing them with context. it builds a narrative structure. One's brain convinces oneself that the dream was the cause of that sound. But the rules of cause and effect are completely reversed. The mind experiences the effect first, hallucinates a cause, and then plays that narrative in the proper cause effect order. This leads us to the following question: what need is there for this hallucinatory world within us? Especially since, as Nietzsche points out, modern people are supposedly rational beings who demand rigorous scientific inquiry and evidence when awake. Nietzsche argues this comes down to evolutionary survival. He says that we have become used to just accepting the first thing that enters our mind as fact throughout history. But the development of our rational capacity and our understanding of reality through science is intensely demanding on our minds and bodies. Rigorous skeptical logic requires time, hesitation, and a massive cognitive load. It may have been a mode of survival in primeval ages. For example, by associating a certain sound with a predator, one could then give themselves a better chance of living. But Nietzsche posits that in our modern state, this remnant is still within us because the demands of thinking are so strenuous that a dream state acts as a relaxation of the mind. This is truly a fascinating insight of Nietzsche's. He is arguing that truth is an exhausting modern luxury. Error, poorly constructed hypotheses, and hallucinations are comforting, less demanding, and deeply ingrained within us. Thus, we dream because our minds need a break from this task. The most significant aspect of this argument is how it pertains to human nature. Historically, philosophers have seen reason as the end-all and be-all of human nature. It is what marks us as separate from animals. It is what makes us unique and of higher value. But Nietzsche is stating that this capacity developed through time and greater stability. In reality, we are not built biologically for rational thought. Rather, our baseline is error and impulse. He goes on, quote, "A related occurrence, which stands as portal and entrance hall of the dream, can actually be observed in full wakefulness. If we close our eyes, the brain produces a host of light impressions and colors, probably as a kind of afterplay and echo of those effects of light which crowd in upon it during the day. Now, however, the reason, in alliance with the imagination, at once assembles these in themselves formless color impressions into definite figures, shapes, landscapes, moving groups. What is actually occurring is again a kind of inferring of the cause from the effect. The mind asks where these light impressions and colors come from and supposes these shapes and figures are their causes. It regards them as occasioning these lights and colors because, by day and with eyes open, it is accustomed to finding that every color, every light impression, does in fact have a cause that occasions it. Here, then, the imagination is continually providing the mind with images borrowed from the sight impressions of the day, and this is precisely the way in which it fashions the dream fantasy. That is to say, the supposed cause is inferred from the effect and introduced after the effect, and all with extraordinary rapidity, so that, as with a conjurer, a confusion of judgment can here arise and successive events appear as simultaneous events, or even with the order of their occurrence reversed. These facts show us how late, more rigorous logical thinking, a clear perception of the nature of cause and effect, must have been evolved if our faculties of reason and understanding, even now, involuntarily grasp at those primitive forms of conclusion and inference, and we still live about half of our life in this condition. The poet and the artist, too, foists upon his moods and states of mind causes which are certainly not the true ones. To this extent, he recalls an earlier humanity and can aid us to an understanding of it." End quote. In this final section of Aphorism 13, Nietzsche continues forward with his biological mechanism inherent within us, but he moves from the dream state to the waking state, providing an example of light impressions. When we close our eyes, there remains light impressions, presumably gathered by the mind throughout the experience of the day. What are formless and diverse colors get fashioned by our mind into definitive figures, shapes, landscapes, and moving groups. Thereby, Nietzsche points out that this mechanism of our mind to seek out cause and effect happens all the time. Our brains cannot handle formless chaos, so whenever something like this arises, it must give it context, form, reason. The end of this aphorism is a subtle and direct critique of Kant. Kant postulated that causality is an a priori category of the mind, a fundamental and pure way that humans structure reality. Nietzsche agrees that we force causality onto the world, but he proves that it is a flawed structure, not a pure truth. We are so poorly adapted to objective truth that even in our awake state of mind, we are constantly tailoring and processing the world in a way that makes it easier for us to understand. That is, even though something might be sitting in plain sight, unadorned and openly real, if it causes our mind some kind of distress, to the point where we cannot make sense of it, we will transform it into something digestible and understandable, even if that goes against what it really is. For example, if we are out for a walk and see a distant shadow or object of some kind, but it is blurry and unstructured because of its distance, our mind will forcefully try to make sense of it. We may even just think to ourselves, that's another human, for the sake of giving it character, rather than it remaining incomprehensible. Nietzsche then ends the aphorism with a pointed attack on poets and artists. In this romantic 19th century that he's writing, the poet and artist were revered by general society as visionaries. Take, for example, Richard Wagner. Historically, art was considered a path to the divine, a way of accessing metaphysical truths. Nietzsche goes straight for this romantic idealization of the artist. He equates the poet to a primitive and dreamer, saying they foist upon their moods to create their art. For example, when a poet feels deeply melancholic or romantic, they do not understand the true physiological origins of that state. Instead, because of the seeming depth and profundity of that emotion, they invent a false, theatrical cause for it. Thus, art is another waking application of this primitive dream logic. Aphorism 14, Sympathetic Resonance, reads, quote, all stronger moods bring with them a sympathetic resonance on the part of related sensations and moods. They, as it were, root up the memory. Something in us is provoked to recollection and becomes aware of similar states and their origins. Thus there come to be constructed habitual rapid connections between feelings and thoughts which, if they succeed one another with lightning speed, are in the end no longer experienced as complexes but as unities. It is in this sense that one speaks of the moral feelings, of the religious feelings, as though these were simple unities. In truth, however, they are rivers with 100 tributaries and sources. Here, too, as so often, the unity of the word is no guarantee of the unity of the thing. End quote. In this aphorism, Nietzsche points to the importance of the stronger moods, the ones which do the heavy lifting in this physiological process of the dream logic. The depth of an emotion or mood can instantly trigger this cause and effect chain, which constructs some memory and produces it within us. Through time, this continual process becomes a habitual response, to the point where, when we used to experience some mood and a memory would come along with it, eventually these would become a unity rather than separate events. The moral and religious feelings, which at some point become some construction of experience and mood, are exactly this transformation. At some point, one could have a profound moral experience and equate the experience with the mood that they derived from it. At some point, they become blind to this origination and just end up equating the two distinct things. Nietzsche is essentially describing what would later become known as a Pavlovian response. For example, if a child is continually and habitually told that a certain behavior they are committing is sinful, the child's brain will eventually wire these two things together with lightning speed. After this point, any experience in which this behavior occurs will immediately be followed by a pang of consciousness or a feeling of shame or fear or whatever the occasioned response was as a child. The point here being that these emotional experiences of morality or religion are, at base, an associative reflex. It is not a morality brought on from high divinity, but rather a biological response and habit. Nietzsche ends the aphorism with a sharp critique of language by pointing out how we associate words with their designations. We boil down complex sensations and impressions into simple words or small phrases. Words like love, shame, guilt, piety, hate have their depths removed in favor of a simple unified expression. We trick ourselves into believing a pure and single thing, an objective truth. In reality, what we experience as piety or love is actually, as Nietzsche states, rivers with 100 tributaries and sources. What does this mean? That the way we experience these concepts is an oversimplification of all that we experience, a synthesis of this experience. All the errors of history and experience remain hidden within our conceptions. Language forces us to simplify these complex contexts, which gives way to metaphysical explanations and claims about divine origins and revelations, representations of concepts as eternal truths. Aphorism 15, no inner and outer in the world, reads, quote, as Democritus transferred the concepts above and below to infinite space, where they make no sense, so philosophers in general transfer the concept, inner and outer, to the essence and phenomena of the world. They believe that profound feelings take one deep into the interior, close to the heart of nature. But such feelings are profound only insofar as when they occur, certain complex groups of thoughts, which we call profound, are scarcely perceptibly, regularly aroused with them. A feeling is profound because we regard the thoughts that accompany it as profound. But a profound thought can nonetheless be very distant from the truth, as, for example, every metaphysical thought is. If one deducts from the profound feeling the element of thought mixed in with it, what remains is the strong feeling. And this has nothing to do with knowledge as such, just as strong belief demonstrates only its strength, not the truth of that which is believed. End quote. Nietzsche opens this aphorism with an analogy about the Greek philosopher Democritus, who posited an infinite universe of atoms and void. And yet, despite the fact that an infinite universe would, strictly speaking, mean that there is no true above and below, he still used concepts like above and below. For Nietzsche, just as an above and a below do not exist within the universe, unless of course we are talking about localized human interpretation because of our experience of ground and gravity, so too, no inner and outer exist in the universe. Because of our own experience of an inner, for example thoughts, and outer, for example the environment, we mirror that onto the world. We assume that reality must have a superficial outer shell, the phenomena, and a profound inner core, say the thing in itself. Again, this is somewhat of a dig at Kant, but also, and in the main, at religious mystics such as Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer argued that by looking inward, one could bypass the outer shell of nature and touch its very heart. Here Nietzsche severs this connection. He argues that looking inward, having this feeling of profundity, does not actually connect you with the heart of nature. He says if feeling is profound, because we regard the thoughts that accompany it as profound. All we are doing is attaching a thought to a complex feeling. We mistake physiology for metaphysical or divine revelation. Nietzsche ends off by saying, "Strong belief demonstrates only its strength, not the truth of that which is believed." And this can be projected onto the previous ideas about dream logic as well. These seemingly deep and profound feelings are just that, nothing more. Just because we perceive these feelings as attached to thoughts or greater ideas does not make them true. Neither the idea themselves or the apparent connection of the feeling with the idea. If some religious fanatic is willing to die for their belief, it does not give any further reason as to the legitimacy of that belief. All they have shown is the strength that they personally have for that conviction. In reality, truth requires cold, methodical, detached deduction, completely stripped of these profound feelings. Aphorism 16, Appearance and Thing in Itself, reads, quote, "Philosophers are accustomed to station themselves before life and experience, before that which they call the world of appearance, as before a painting that has been unrolled once and for all and unchangeably depicts the same scene. This scene, they believe, has to be correctly interpreted so as to draw a conclusion as to the nature of the being that produced the picture, that is to say, as to the nature of the thing in itself, which it is customary to regard as the sufficient reason for the existence of the world of appearance. As against this, more rigorous logicians, having clearly identified the concept of the metaphysical as that of the unconditioned, consequently also unconditioning, have disputed any connection between the unconditioned, the metaphysical world, and the world we know. So that what appears in appearance is precisely not the thing in itself, and no conclusion can be drawn from the former as to the nature of the latter. Both parties, however, overlook the possibility that this painting, that which we humans call life and experience, has gradually become, is indeed still fully in course of becoming, and should thus not be regarded as a fixed object on the basis of which a conclusion as to the nature of its originator, the sufficient reason, may either be drawn or pronounced undrawable." End quote. In this aphorism, Nietzsche touches upon the historical distinction between the world of appearance and the thing in itself, the metaphysical distinction between the world in which we live that is supposedly just an appearance, an illusionary world, and the real world, which is the thing in itself, that we can access through our minds for some philosophers, and others through death, perhaps, and yet again others have come to the conclusion that we have no access to it. Nietzsche opens with an analogy that dismantles this distinction. He compares philosophers to art critics staring at a rolled out painting that depicts an unchanging scene. He critiques two kinds of these art critics. Firstly, the theologians and classical metaphysicians. These thinkers see the painting and believe they can deduce the nature of the painter, their god or creator or thing in itself. They believe that the universe has a sufficient reason for existing, therefore meaning there must be some metaphysical cause for it. In this case, I suppose a cause for the painting being made. Secondly, are the rigorous logicians, again partly an attack on Kant. Kant revolutionized philosophy by arguing that, because we are tied to our sense perception and reason can only travel so high, we can only ever know the phenomenal world, the painting, or world of appearance. The thing in itself, or noumenal world, is completely inaccessible to the human senses. Kant is correctly able to sever the link between the two that most philosophers cannot. However, Nietzsche points out that Kant and these other logicians still accept the premise that the painting is fixed and static, thus separating us from the ultimate truth about reality, in this example, the origins of the painting. Fundamentally, both kinds Theologians and metaphysicians and rigorous logicians are wrong because they lack an evolutionary framework. They treat reality as static, as being. Nietzsche instead proposes that reality is becoming. We can see a Heraclitean influence here. In this example, the painting is continually evolving and changing. Trying to deduce eternal truths from an ever changing painting would be unwarranted. He ends by saying, in the case of the first group of art critics, we cannot judge that this conclusion can be drawn, and for the second group of art critics, we cannot judge that this conclusion cannot be drawn. Nietzsche goes on, quote, because we have for millennia made moral, aesthetic, religious demands on the world, looked upon it with blind desire, passion, or fear, and abandoned ourselves to the bad habits of illogical thinking, this world has gradually become so marvelously variegated, frightful, meaningful, soulful, it has acquired color. But we have been the colorists. It is the human intellect that has made appearance appear and transported its erroneous basic conceptions into things. Late, very late, it has reflected on all this, and now the world of experience and the thing in itself seem to it so extraordinarily different from one another and divided apart that it rejects the idea that the nature of one can be inferred from the nature of the other, or invites us in a chillingly mysterious fashion to abandon our intellect, our personal will, so as to attain to the real by becoming real oneself. Others, again, have assembled all the characteristic traits of our world of appearance, that is to say, the idea of the world spun out of intellectual errors we have inherited, and, instead of indicting the intellect as the guilty party, have charged the essence of things with being the cause of the very uncanny character this world in fact possesses, and have preached redemption from being. End quote. Here we get to the core argument that Nietzsche is making in this aphorism. He opens by arguing that the only reason the world has such profundity and depth and color is because we ourselves have given it those qualities. This answers the question of why the world would be as such if there were no metaphysical answer or background. We have plastered these qualities onto an otherwise indifferent universe. Because of our historical lack of scientific thinking, of a mind for history, for cold, rational thought, we instead used illogical thinking, or dream logic, to survive. As is usual for us, we explain things through the limited experiences we had of the world. We anthropomorphized everything around us, especially those things which were difficult to grasp. Again, Nietzsche points to the reaction from a couple of schools of thoughts upon hearing this argument. Firstly, there are the mystics. When philosophers come to the realization that the intellect is flawed, they suggest the utter destruction of the ego and abandonment of one's intellect in favor of merging with the real. Secondly, are the pessimists. This reaction in particular singles out Schopenhauer, who looked at the world and saw its terrifying, chaotic, and suffering-filled nature, and blamed it on the essence of things. His conclusion was that life is a mistake and preached a kind of asceticism. By doing so, he believed one could redeem themselves from existence. Nietzsche points out here that Schopenhauer was completely lacking in historical sense. If he did have it, or any of it, he would have been able to spot that, as Nietzsche says, the intellect is the guilty party. Nietzsche goes on, quote, with all these conceptions, the steady and laborious process of science, which will one day celebrate its greatest triumph in a history of the genesis of thought, will in the end decisively have done. For the outcome of this history may well be the conclusion. That which we now call the world is the outcome of a host of errors and fantasies which have gradually arisen and grown entwined with one another in the course of the overall evolution of the organic being, and are now inherited by us as the accumulated treasure of the entire past, as treasure, for the value of our humanity depends upon it. Rigorous science is capable of detaching us from this ideational world only to a limited extent, and more is certainly not to be desired, inasmuch as it is incapable of making any essential inroad into the power of habits of feeling acquired in primeval times, but it can, quite gradually and step by step, illuminate the history of the genesis of this world as idea, and, for brief periods at any rate, lift us up out of the entire proceeding. Perhaps we shall then recognize that the thing in itself is worthy of Homeric laughter, that it appeared to be so much, indeed everything, and is actually empty, that is to say, empty of significance. End quote. As usual with Nietzsche, he had an uncannily far-seeing eye. He ends this aphorism by offering his solution to the problem. For him, the ultimate savior is not to be found through the development of metaphysics, art, poetry, or religion. It is steady and laborious science, not just any field, such as biology or physics, but in particular what he calls the history of the genesis of thought. This is what we would now call evolutionary psychology and neuroscience. Eventually, science will be able to map out how our profoundest beliefs are just an accumulation of our necessary errors. He calls these errors an accumulated treasure of the entire past, recognizing their utility and necessity in aiding humans to evolve and grow. In any case, science cannot completely rewrite our nervous system, which includes both primitive and modern parts, but it can grant us clarity in our understanding of ourselves and origins. Nietzsche ends this aphorism with a devastating conclusion for all budding classical philosophers, metaphysicians, and mystics. When science finally uncovers the history of the genesis of thought, we will look back at the thing in itself, this ultimate triumph and confusion of 2,000 years' worth of philosophical history, the thing philosophers agonized over, wrote lifetimes worth over, and erupt into Homeric laughter, meaning an unstoppable and boisterous laughter. In the Iliad, this referred to the kind of grand laughter of the gods who look down at the absurdity of us human mortals. This laughter will arise because of the inevitable realization that what we took to be our most sacred and important understanding of the universe, that it was ruled by a god or some profound will, was actually completely devoid of anything. This universe will simply be empty. But why? Because this depth we were chasing after within the deepest, most structural parts of our reality were merely a reflection of our want for that depth and our blind physiological coloring. At the time Nietzsche was writing Human All Too Human, preparing for his disassociation with his old master, Wagner, and moving away from Romanticism toward what we could broadly categorize as psychology and history, Wagner himself was writing his latest three-act drama, Parsifal, another work of his swept up in grand style. Of course, at the time, their ties were not yet officially nor fully severed, and both sent each other copies of their works. Later, in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche remarks, quote, "This crossing of the two books, it seemed to me as if I heard them make an ominous sound. Did it not sound like the clash of rapiers? At any rate, that is how we both felt, for we both said nothing." End quote. In the next video, we'll be breaking down Aphorisms 17 through 22, which will serve as a sequence wherein Nietzsche dissects and explores the metaphysical world. We'll see how he dismantles the thing in itself, critiques mathematics as a survival mechanism, and attacks free will and moral agency. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have a wonderful day.